host Ross McIntosh and welcome to my major project breakdown. Throughout these videos I'll outline the various stages of my 6300 major project from concept to final product. The initial concept for my major project was to create a short cinematic within Unreal Engine, utilising as many skill sets as possible from my 2 years at SAE. The decision to be set in the Star Wars universe was influenced by a few factors, the first being that I was ultimately going to have to source some assets where there was no time to create my own. Luckily enough, there's a huge correlation between people who like Star Wars and people who model assets for free on the internet. The second point, and probably the most important, is that Star Wars is a cultural touchstone. It's a franchise spanning over 40 years of content with multiple interpretations and instantly recognisable imagery and themes. This was important as I was trying to tell a coherent story within the cinematic, so using an existing narrative helped with that. Also because the franchise is so diverse already, I would have a bit more freedom with the design choices throughout the cinematic too. I knew going in that creating a cinematic of this size would be a great deal of work, so made sure to plan it out as best I could from the start. My classmate Anthony Gallagher would be contributing VFX elements for the project, so we made a Trello page to plot out a timeline for the development. We would regularly check in with one another through Zoom calls to ensure we were each progressing okay and to discuss ideas to implement and change throughout the production. We set deadlines for each aspect of the project to make sure we didn't overextend ourselves with certain parts. I knew from experience it can be easy to fixate on one area of a project, which in turn causes another area to suffer, so we tried to avoid that as best as possible. We looked at concept art and footage from the existing Star Wars films and games to get ideas for things to include in the project here and there. I created some basic storyboards to better outline my original concept. So the workflow of this using another one as sounding boards was very beneficial as we could give each other consistent feedback on areas of our work and discuss how to proceed moving forward. A major issue with developing a project of this scale is just the sheer volume of elements involved. Having good file management was essential for tracking the Maya, 3ds Max, Substance, Unreal Engine, Alchemist and Mixer files we were using. This was also true for building 5 enormous environments within Unreal Engine. It became quite easy to lose track of cameras and assets if they weren't filed away properly. By the time filming was finished, I had over 190 gigs of renders to work with, spread across 60 scenes. This made working remotely very complicated between Anthony and I, so we became very reliant on screen sharing through Zoom to communicate design decisions through editing. I created the environment early on in production as I felt its design would help influence some of the scenes moving forward. I began off looking at existing Star Wars concept images, then creating a few rough thumbnails of key sequences I'd planned, then proceeded to block these sketches out within Unreal Engine. With a good idea of each environment structure, I began modelling the assets to be used throughout. The bunker and temple scenes would comprise of broad repetitive elements throughout, so I modelled their respective components in a modular workflow within 3ds Max. Each component for the scene adheres to a specific sizing guide, making them assemble precisely to the grid system within 3ds Max and Unreal Engine. This method allowed me to assemble them seamlessly within Unreal in different arrangements as they might be needed. I decided to keep these assets very low poly as they really weren't featured too heavily within the cinematic and did not require too much detail. I also tried to be as efficient as possible with unwraps, having certain assets share UVs where it was applicable. Once modelled and unwrapped, these components were textured in Substance Painter. When texturing modular assets, I like to create a master file with the materials I plan to use. This way I can ensure consistency between each component. To get the exact type of aesthetic I envisioned, I decided to create the base materials within Substance Alchemist myself. This workflow has been really beneficial to me in the past as it grants me a lot more control of the design. I would be using poly painting to add variation to the component design, so within the Substance master file I create a couple of different versions of each texture, adding detail layers like dirt, moss and cracks to be applied later within Unreal Engine using vertex painting. For the temple scene, I did the exact same workflow through 3ds Max, with the difference this time being that I utilised Quixel Mixer to create textures in place of Substance Painter and Alchemist. I was quite new to Mixture when I started this project, but it quickly became apparent how powerful some of the photo scan textures can be. The software itself was a little bit buggy at times, especially when trying to apply the same method of master files for texture sets, but in the end it turned out pretty well. Once I'd worked out its intricacies, this was not much of an issue, so once again I created a couple of variations of the master material to be polypainted in Engine. It was really important to learn Mixer for this project, as a huge factor in streamlining the design would be utilising Quixel's Megascan asset library. Texturing my own assets within Mixer helped bridge the aesthetic between their assets and my own when finalising the environment. It also helped when using their bridge tool to import their assets. I was able to retouch the existing Megascan asset library with Mixer textures and balance them between my own designs and theirs. The landscape was created within Unreal Engine using the engine's sculpting tools and some custom brushes I had made in Photoshop. I originally planned to sculpt certain areas within ZBrush for accuracy, but the landscape tools were effective enough that this was no longer seemed necessary. The landscape is textured using a layer blend system, which allowed me to accurately paint different textures onto specific areas where desired. I created 5 variations of landscape within Quixel Mixer to paint dirt, rock, sand, grass and mud across the environment. I experimented with adding masking parameters, but this turned out to be a bit unnecessary in the end. The tessellation generated from Quixel textures was also far too intense, so in the end it was reduced to a factor of 0.001. In addition to this, I created deferred decals for placing extra details like puddles and moss from maps I had created within Photoshop. Once the landscape was fitting, I constructed the temple and bunker scenes from my modular assets, building their respective materials with LERP systems, allowing me to polypaint some variety by attributing their alpha channels to the textures I had created prior. Once these were blocked out, I proceeded to populate the scene with primary assets like rocks and cliff ridges sourced from Quixel Megascans, using a temporal dithering node to help mask them seamlessly into my custom landscape. Using SpeedTree, I created 5 or 6 variations of conifer trees and added basic wind nodes to their leaves to fill out the exterior environment. I also created tree cards in Photoshop just from some static 2D imagery I'd found on textures.com, just for the far exterior environment as well. I was planning to use Unreal Engine's new atmospheric sky system for sunlight, which replaces the standard sky sphere and subsequently its clouds. So I also created some cloud cards in Photoshop for filling out the skies. These cards are essentially just static 2D images with opacity parameters and a depth fade node I linked to the environment's fog settings. Unfortunately, the volumetric cloud system previewed in Unreal 4.26 was not made available in time, so these cloud cards had to do. The exterior environment also had a few mountains spotted throughout to give the scene some sense of scale. I created these by first moulding a plane using soft solid brushes in 3ds Max before decimating it and sculpting some details within ZBrush. Using stock images of rocks, I created some custom alpha brushes to be used within ZBrush to quickly add crags and ridges to their design. Once I had 4 variations to populate the scene, I used Quixel Mixer to texture them, once again using the same method as before with a master file within the chosen materials compiled for consistency across all 4 mountains. With the majority of primary assets in place, I finished the environments off by adding a secondary details like foliage, stick stones and some custom decals I'd created earlier. I knew the cinematic was going to require multiple iterations of the environment to cover the different times of day and sequence of events, so once I had a rough draft of its final composition, I made iterations of the project to work in separately for each occasion. Each scene has distinct lighting and atmosphere, which I tuned for the atmospheric sun and exponential fog volumes. Unreal Engine's 4.25 new atmospheric sun tool allowed me to make a physically accurate atmosphere based on the rotation of a directional light within the scene, imitating the time of day. On top of this representation, there are also parameters to manually adjust atmospheric scattering and absorption to create exaggerated hues within the environment, allowing us to create a more sci-fi feel to certain parts of the day. One of the more challenging aspects of the environment was achieving the lighting for the night sequences. I was struggling to get the desired effect I wanted from the atmospheric sun and world lighting. This was mostly due to how diverse some of the shot lighting was. An example would be how the bunker's night sequence had to be light enough to display characters accurately, but not overexposed when adding the additional lighting like fire and lightsabers. I found the best solution was in manually adjusting the exposure value of the global post-processing volume. By tuning it down slightly below its usual value, I could create the desired effect without compromising other factors. And because most of this was done in one parameter, I was able to adjust it within the cinematic sequencer when necessary for each shot. All the lighting within each scene was entirely ray traced, which allowed me to work freely in real time, adapting the scene as needed on each sequence. This was really important to workflow, as waiting for lighting breaks on each sequence could be extremely time consuming and offset the project's deadline. A major obstacle for this project was sourcing adequate resources for animation. The timeline did not allow for me to model and rig multiple characters for use throughout the cinematic, so from the start I had to be quite creative in tackling this. I decided that the best solution would be to source character assets where possible and adapt them to cinematic as needed. I had previously used an artist called Truon CG's rigs in another project and found a character within his library that would be sufficient for use. Truon's cyber character was well rigged with adequate controls and IK/FK systems. The only issues would be its lack of textures, which I would have to recreate from scratch. This wasn't too much trouble, as I would be adapting most source content to a Star Wars aesthetic anyway. Similarly to my environment workflow, I created a couple base materials within Substance Alchemist and compiled a master file in Substance Painter of the materials I would use for each variation of the cyborg. The hero character would require just 2 iterations, one clean and one damaged, to suit the story's narrative. So after creating the base for its clean version, I went back and hand painted more detail to the damaged version. Having the same base rig operating as multiple characters was a really good way of saving time in production. It meant not having to source, familiarise and fix another character to work within Unreal Engine. The second major character I sourced was the K2SO droid, which I purchased from an artist online. This rig was modelled pretty well and came with suitable textures, but the rigging was not fit for use and so had to be rebuilt entirely from scratch. Using Maya's Quick Rig IK system, I built a new skeleton adapted for Unreal Engine with proper root bones, then weight painted the model to as functional as possible. The issue with this was the intricacies of the model's shape did not lend too well for a standard rig, and there would often be issues where the hip joint stretched unnaturally. This, however, could be hidden within certain camera shots and lighting, so it wasn't the worst. The textures for this model were of decent standard, but still required a lot of work as they would be a major focal point of the several scenes. In the same workflow as before, I took them into Substance Painter and touched them up, adding details to fit the story's aesthetic and narrative. And just like the cyborg, I made multiple colour variations to populate some of the opening scenes. I also sourced a Stormtrooper character from Gumroad, which, like the cyborg, was functionally rigged with the exception of 1 or 2 elements that had to be removed. And much the same way as the other 2 characters, I redid the textures entirely to fit the desired aesthetic. Outside of these 3 characters, I created a few other characters and assets that would be required, including the BD droid, Gonk droid, Mouse droid, and several lightsaber variations. All of the assets and characters are modelled within 3ds Max and textured in my usual workflow within Substance Painter. The lightsabers were also designed in a quasi-modular fashion to streamline their assembly. I created dozens unwrapped components, then paired them in different ways to create new models. This saved time, but also meant they all maintained a similar aesthetic. The hero asset lightsaber was modelled separately in far more detail to allow for feature shots. I designed it in multiple elements like a real tool so that it could be assembled and disassembled piece by piece. I rigged the BD and Gonk droid using the same method as the K2 unit. This was not too time consuming as they are both bipeds with no arms, and because I had modelled them with the intention for rigging, I had separated their elements in a way that made this much easier for myself. These assets are imported into Unreal as simple FBX formats, where I then build the materials for texture maps exported from Substance. I always use Substance preset export settings with the AO roughness and metalness combined into one singular map spread across the RGB alphas. Because this is a cinematic workflow, most of the textures are at least 2K, with hero assets being 4K. To save texture budget, I export emissive maps separately on much lower resolutions as they don't really require much detail. Within Unreal Engine, I have a default master material for assembling basic assets, with parameters built in to tune roughness and metalness on each channel, as well as a system to control tessellation if need be. If I'm using displacement maps from Quixel Mixer, this is done usually in place of the metalness channel. This saves a lot of time as there's roughly 50 different materials spread across the project, and building each one becomes a bit tedious. With a master material in place, I can simply swap out the texture maps in each material and tune existing parameters to my liking rather than building a whole new material for each time. My animation workflow for this project was pretty straightforward. I would create a master project within Maya of each character in their respective A or T poses, with all their joints keyed and their Unreal route established. The Cyborg rig was not built for this system, so I adapted it using Advanced Skeleton 5's Unreal route plugin, which essentially reorganises the character's joint hierarchy to include a root bone the Unreal Engine can read properly. The other characters were all rigged by me, so they all had this system in place already. I then export all the bones and geometries in FBX for importing to Unreal Engine. These exports operate as master skeletons of each character, so this process only needs to be done once. If a character has a particular string of actions throughout the cinematic, I try to make a template for this akin to a walk cycle. This means that I can reuse the same scene and tweak aspects instead of a completely new animation. An example of this would be the Stormtrooper rigs. There was going to be several scenes of them marching and walking around, so I created a walk cycle as a base, then made a few iterations to break up the scene. My workflow throughout the project was to animate the main scenes first. Then, once they were implemented in Unreal Engine, I would return to the Maya scene and touch up elements as needed. All of my camera animations are created within Unreal Engine, so I like to do a complete 360-degree animation in Maya, so there's potential to shoot from different angles if need be. This is a bit more work, and it's quite time consuming, but I feel it offers a better end result. Once an animation is complete, I use Maya's built-in Game Explorer plugin to explore the deformation routes, without any geometry for implementing to Unreal Engine as an animation asset. This method means that if the animation needs tweaking in any way somewhere down the line, it's as easy as adjusting the Maya scene and re-importing the asset to Unreal. Once all my assets are in place within the project for a scene, I start the process of building the cinematic. I start with creating a camera to plot my movements for each shot. My camera of choice for this project was the DSLR digital film preset, with a few adjustments made to the minimal f-stop and shutter speed. I found this camera in the past to be the best approach when manually adjusting aperture and focal lengths within broad environments like this one, so it was my go-to for the majority of sequences. I then create a level sequence for each shot. I have considered using master sequences of camera cuts in the past, but I actually find this workflow quite messy. Most of my workflow is designed to be very malleable, so I can return to it for edits down the line, so having them all under one sequence makes this a bit tricky. I also plan to edit the film in After Effects, so there wasn't really much need for the functionality of a master sequence. In the level sequence, I track the actors I'll be using, along with the cinematic camera I just created. I stage the actors' positions within the shot and track their animation asset through the sequencer. I run through this animation a few times using the auto key function within the sequencer to plot my camera placements, almost like a pose-to-pose workflow. When I'm happy with the shots, I use the graph system to edit the camera's transform keys to my liking for a smoother shot. Unreal Engine has tools for camera movements like cranes and tracks, but I have often found them more hindering than helpful, and only used the camera crane on a couple of occasions for revolving shots. I then do a pass of the sequence where I adjust the camera's focal points more accurately. Similarly to the transform graph, I make sure the zoom and focal lengths are transitioning smoothly. Unreal's focal length debug tool and eyedropper are very useful in marking exact focal distance, something that can become quite tricky when operating in low light and high aperture settings. We wanted to try and achieve two distinct style of shots to match the contrast and tones between the night and day scenes, so to achieve a more hectic, action-oriented feel for the night sequences, we used an iPad to create virtual camera shots inside Unreal Engine. This is done by utilising the iPad's motion sensors to pair a camera actor within the scene. We can then shoot the sequence through the iPad screen and log the transforms to a cinematic camera actor for the final sequence. The outcome of this had quite a nice effect, but was a little clunky at times, so I ended up cleaning up a lot of the transform keys manually within the sequencer for the final render. With the camera and animation movements set up, I use a time dilation track to adjust the pacing of each shot. This is an extremely useful tool as it easily modifies the speed of the whole sequence and injects or removes frames to match the frames per second. Combined with the animation playback tracker on the actor, I can scale the speed of an animation asset and the environment accurately without compromising one another. This workflow makes returning to a scene for reshoots very simple because the time dilation track can manually increase the frame count, allowing animation to function outside their original frame rates. I then adjust any necessary lighting and VFX elements for the shot as needed. Almost all of the sequences filmed at night require additional lighting to the existing environment to better frame characters. Unreal Sequencer is very effective at achieving this, as like everything else, lights and their properties, such as intensity and colour, can be tracked and keyed within the sequencer. This is useful for simulating dynamic light values, such as fire and lightsabers within several of the shots. VFX elements operate similarly in that respect. With the sequencer, I'm able to track Niagara components of each VFX blueprint, meaning I can manipulate the beginning and end of the system's life cycle to control when things like lightsabers power up and laser blasts trigger. This was a little tricky with some elements like the lightning, where the margin for misfiring a trigger was quite large due to the variables of the particle system. To mitigate this, I would render the scene a few times, then take the best frames from the results for the final cuts. There were occasions where certain systems did not function in this respect, so more creative methods had to be used to achieve a end result. An example of this is the TIE Fighter hologram scene. This effect could only really be toggled on and off through the level blueprint, so my workaround was to simply render the whole scene twice, one with it connected and one without, then stitch the renders together in post to simulate the effect of it toggling on and off. With the camera actors, lighting and VFX in place, the last step before rendering was to do a pass of the environment. This was mainly polishing and repositioning assets in areas to a higher standard. The environment for these sets were enormous, so it wasn't really feasible to have the whole thing completely detailed. This step helped ensure the highest possible visual quality of each scene. To achieve the best visual fidelity for each shot, I used some engine config commands to upscale the value of my renders. In the global post-processing volume setting, I maxed out the screen percentage and SSR intensity to achieve sharper reflections and shadows. In addition to this, the camera viewports were set to 200%, and all lighting was ray traced for the best definition possible. Unreal Engine does have its own post-processing settings within each camera to grade shots, but I decided that a workflow with flat grading was more suitable. The final renders were done at 4K, then brought into After Effects to be cut together and graded manually using its built-in lumetri filters. The final stage of my major project was editing. I had about 13 minutes of footage in total, and after some discussion with my lecturer, decided to edit that down to a trailer format for submission. I went through the footage making note of what I felt were the best sequences and most fitting for a cinematic trailer, and mind mapped some ideas for music to set it to. Ultimately, I decided to use the Force Awakens trailer theme created by John Williams. This was for a few reasons. I wanted to include the iconic Star Wars overture within the trailer, and this piece of music had a good mix of slow and fast-paced sections, which would help evoke the different themes and atmosphere within the narrative. All of my footage is rendered out of Unreal Engine at the highest resolution my GPU can handle, and I've adopted some tricks for achieving this. The render settings within the sequencer are set to 4K resolution, but using post-processing settings in this camera and engine configuration, I can surpass this for a higher quality output. By adjusting the screen space resolution intensity past 100% in the camera configuration, I can increase the quality of each render while still getting a visual representation within the editor viewport. This is a delicate process as certain scenes are more demanding than others, such as particle effects heavy shots and scenes with multiple reflections. So having this visual feedback is essential for balancing these values. The same is true for using console commands to upsample anti-aliasing, ambient occlusion and ray traced reflections, as these had to be tuned scene to scene within a range my graphics card could still handle. With the footage selected, I made a quick previs example of the trailer with static shots of the scenes I plan to use, set to the timings of the music. When I refined this a bit more with some changes, I set about creating the final cut. Within After Effects, I arranged the sequences to the tempo of the music, using the opacity transform on each sample to control transitions from shot to shot. I layered on effects in certain areas that I felt needed some adjustment. All of the camera effects like lens flare, aperture shifts, etc. are actually done in Engine because they yield more accurate results. But there were occasions where I felt After Effects' basic overlay effects, like the radio camera blur, worked well, so there was no need to re-render those scenes. I also retouched the particularly problematic lightning sequence in Photoshop. I was having issues getting an ideal render of the effects in Engine, so took the approach of just cleaning it up myself by hand painting detail into the dozen or so frames necessary. For the most part, I was really happy with the raw renders, so the majority of scenes only required minimal grading in post. Everything had small touch-ups to the light levels just to push highlights and contrast, but most of the naturally lit sequences were 90% of the way there already. For scenes requiring more attention, I used After Effects' native Lumetri filter to adjust the colour palettes and values. Lumetri is a really nice filter effect because it has a bunch of different basic adjustment samples under one roof, which makes keeping track of the effects and staging their transitions in the timeline really simplistic. It also comes with temperature and tone filters, which is a great way to quickly sample a shot before grading it more accurately. The After Effects project is constructed at 4K resolution, then compressed to 1080p in an Adobe Media Encoder for the final submission.